before there was a law code, there was the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, so even the great orators in Athens, instead of whenever they would make a case about why someone should be put in jail or exiled, they would rarely appeal to law. They didn't have a lot of law. They would often appeal to the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Gardner and I'm here today with Paul, Martin, and a returning guest, Mitchell Hawley. Welcome back.
It's great to be here. Thanks, guys.
Mitchell is the principal of Memoria Academy, and he's also the author of our Greek series, The Forms. So we're glad to have you, Mitchell.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you guys, my friends.
Are you speaking for all of us?
It's great. It's great to be here with most of you.
Well, today we are in the world of Homer. We are discussing his two most famous works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're going to talk about why it matters that we read them, and we're going to discuss their influence on Western literature and culture. Before we dive in, we always discuss what we're reading. Mitchell, since you're back, let's start with you.
Yeah, great. What am I reading? So there's two books that I'm working through right now, but one of them is actually, it's been like 13 or 14 years since I read a Greek grammar. And so I'm slowly working through one of my favorite Greek grammars.
Sounds like pleasure reading.
I heard,
there's
the,
some good
plot, I heard
reading.
the plot is weak.
The plot is very weak. The only reason I would go back through this one is because there's some good readings in there. And so there's readings and grammar. It's a good way to just sort of stay sharp. That was the most boring thing I could have thought to say. So there it is.
Hold on. Can we bring up you reading to your daughter and didn't you have like Winnie the Pooh in Greek and what she said about Greek?
Oh, so we have several books that are in Greek for Sylvia. And one of them is just like about animals and where they live. And I love reading them to her because they're in Greek, and and when she was young, she understood most of it, but she doesn't want to do the work, and so she's she's getting away from it. And so I held up this. We were having a reading day a few weeks ago, and we were just reading through like all of her books, and she has like 100. Okay, and I held up one that was in Greek, and it used to be one of her favorite books, and I said, Sylvia, let's read this one, and she said, no, that's in a different language, and I don't like it.
Yeah.
That was the saddest thing she could have said to me in that moment. But yeah, thanks for bringing up that painful memory.
Yeah,
I think I came the next day and it was sort of expressing some sadness.
Yeah,
to
you were. I feel like painful memories though help our audience. They see that. It's, even though Mitchell is trying to train Sylvia in ancient Greek from when she was born, she still just doesn't like it.
She resisted. Yeah, we all resist the good.
I find Mitchell terribly therapeutic.
His pain is helpful to you?
Yeah, good training of some kind. Fortitude.
How about you, Paul?
I am on page 1010 of War and Peace.
Progress.
Yes, I think it was like on 650 or something the last time we talked. But I did have a week off, and I just tried to crank through it as much as I could. It's great. It's a wonderful book. I had some lady at the airport or at a restaurant or something. She saw it and she was like, that's one of my favorite books. I'm like, that's nice. And, I don't really know what to, engage, how to engage with that outside of the podcast. I just talk about books here. That's,
Don't do it in public.
Yeah. And I had other people see it when I was on vacation and they were like, wow, that's a vacation book. I'm like, yeah, it's nice.
Well, I think they were referring to how huge it is.
Yeah, it was huge. It is huge.
It's like a 6-month commitment.
Yeah, but I only have like 100 pages until I get to the epilogue, and then I have another 100 pages of the epilogue itself.
Yeah,
which doesn't really feel right. But
the book didn't close down, so we had to add the epilogue. At the end.
Yeah.
Oh, Martin.
Well, I'm reading several things as usual. I'm reading a book, The Military Life of Gustavus Adolphus, which is fascinating to me. The Swedish king at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, the first part of it anyway. And he's the general who comes in, and there's a lot of innovations that have to be made because of a lot of which are done because of technology. So gunpowder is the new technology we're dealing with, and so he's the one who really brought military tactics into conformity with the new gunpowder. And so they had to do some things differently. And so that's what he's doing, and that's why he's so successful. One of the most successful military figures in history. Actually, very few people have heard of him. But that's a part of a series, The Military Lives of, by, I can't remember his first name. The last name is Dupuy, D-U-P-U-Y. And he wrote a whole series of these, and I think they were intended maybe for younger people. But they're really well written, and he gets into the strategy.
Were they sort of like turn of the century, or when were they published?
They were written in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a set of biographies?
Yeah, a set of military biographies. They're absolutely wonderful. Also reading, just finished The Cherokee Trail, another Louis L'Amour book. And what he explains this country in so many ways. So he's talking about how he says in every small town, one of the characters says this, in every small town in the West, there was a bookstore. People needed, there was a high demand for books. And the books these bookstores carried were all classics because people wanted to buy a book they could read 3 or 4 times because that's what they did. They didn't have time to read the smaller or the easier reads that you would just read once. They wanted something.
The time or the money.
Yeah, so they were reading Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. They were reading Plutarch. They were reading those kinds of books.
Everyone out on the prairie was reading Ivanhoe.
What's that?
Everyone out on the prairie.
Yes.
Right after bringing in the cattle, they just opened up Ivanhoe.
People. The West was apparently highly literate.
Well, and you think about it, right? Like, what is entertainment, right? When you go home at night and you don't have television, entertainment's reading good books. And if you can only get a certain amount of them, then you would get books that you could read and reread. I mean, I would say, like, I have a library now that if I could no longer acquire any more books, I'd be happy. Like, it would take me a few years to go through every book I had. Yeah, and by the time I got the end of that, I'd be willing to go back and start at the beginning. You know?
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
And I'm reading Plutarch's chapter on Numa Pompilius.
Is that for something you're doing with the college?
No.
Is lives.
What's that?
That's the live. Are you going through the lives?
Yeah.
Plutarch's lives?
I actually...
They're nice and short.
It would have been really good. I should have read that before.
Well, this is the book that gets mentioned in a lot in from 100 years ago. People were reading those kinds of books, and Plutarch is mentioned again and again and again because he's going over all these great figures in Roman
founding
history.
fathers mentioned Plutarch a lot. Plutarch and Cicero.
But Numa was the one who like established the Roman religious rites, right?
Yes.
And so I feel like I should have read that before teaching Sisters on the Nature of the Gods because it would have refreshed in my mind what was important to Roman religion.
Yeah, and Plutarch makes this point, and I've noticed this before, is that the Romans have sort of 2 traits, and they're represented by Romulus and Numa Pompilius. Romulus is the energetic, action-oriented, violent military.
He was raised by wolves. So
what's that?
He was raised by wolves.
Yeah, when you're raised by wolves, that can happen. And then Numa Pompilius is the sort of
societal,
and religious, pietistic.
Yes,
because the Romans were known for piety.
With all the Aeneas,
so you put Romulus.
Some Romans were known for piety.
But
you have kind of those 2 strains in the Roman
those are the
culture,
2 major strains, and they're right there at the beginning in Romulus and
reflected again in the Aeneid. Especially pious being the most important virtue.
Aeneas is the personification of
in Virgil's Aeneid. I mean, that's that famous picture, right, in the Aeneid where he's coming out of Troy and he has his grandfather on his back and his son in his hand, or his father on his back and his son in his hand.
Yeah.
That's just the ultimate picture of being pious. It's respect for the past and carrying on that to the future. It's a beautiful. Is it in Italy? Is it in Rome? That sculpture of him carrying
it
out
is.
of.
I think I saw it when I.
It's very famous. Sense. Google it. I don't know. I can't remember, but it's just a very touching.
Jess, what are you reading?
I have nothing to report because I'm still working through the Lincoln Highway. It's not as long as War and Peace, so I don't have that excuse. But I was going to look up my page number today, and I forgot. But
yes, I had to ask my wife to do it for me because I got here and I thought, I don't know where I'm at.
I know. Next time I'll report the page number. Yeah. It's not huge, but it's not nothing.
But so far, are you liking it?
I am.
Mm-hmm. Disappointing.
And speaking of Amor Tolls, the Gentleman in Moscow streaming series is starting soon.
Really?
Who's the
I forget the actor's name. It's not somebody I knew, but the preview, he nails it.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Homework.
What streaming platform is it going to be on?
I don't remember.
This is not
I saw it on
approval of
IMDb.
any of those dirty, awful streaming programs.
Oh, I can attest for, because there are some scenes in
Gentlemen
in Moscow that are, I'd say, for a mature audience.
Sure.
And Hollywood, they'll play those up. I don't know.
Oh yeah, they'll be highlighted.
Yeah. But in terms of the production quality, it looked like it would be very good.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Man, I'm add that to my list.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not.
You wouldn't.
Oh.
I might
That
watch
goes
it
deep.
fine. Jeez, this fascination with him just blows my mind. Anyway, on we go.
You curmudgeon, Paul.
Yeah, he's
I am
not
a
500
curmudgeon.
years
I'm a
old, so-
proud curmudgeon.
Oh, an old soul. Well, to the topic at hand, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Mitchell, I'd like to start with you and ask if you could set the scene for us. So in terms of a historical context, can you just help us place ourselves?
Yeah.
In the context, help us situate ourselves with these two works and why it matters that we understand background and context before we even talk about maybe even a summary of the works.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's fascinating about the setting is that there's this really mythic setting for the Iliad and the Odyssey. So every Greek would have known about the war with the Trojans. It was sort of central and defining for their culture. And what's funny about the Iliad and the Odyssey is that the war with the Trojans was a 10-year war, but the Iliad only covers 1 year, the last year of that 10-year war. And thousands and thousands of other pieces of literature were written about that war. And we have some of them in part, but really we only have in full the things that were preserved, which was the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so you're getting an even smaller picture. Some of the other sources fill out that war. Like, for example, something famous that is not included in the Iliad and the Odyssey would be the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse doesn't make an appearance in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's briefly mentioned in the Odyssey, but it's...
Isn't that in the Aeneid?
Yeah, it is.
It's in, but it's not in the Iliad. It's not in the Iliad.
Right,
it's only
right.
briefly mentioned.
But
That's something that
But
Homer
Virgil
just assumed.
also wrote hundreds of years later.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Right. So that it's that mythic background of that really culturally defining mythic battle with the Trojans that is the setting of the book. And while we know other things about it, about what happened based upon other sources, the Iliad only covers a very small portion of that battle. And it doesn't cover the sack of Troy. It doesn't cover Achilles' death.
Is that because that's not his chief concern?
Well, sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, he's all that to say, what is the background? The background is one portrayal of this really significant cultural event, but the one that has endured. I mean, it was incredibly difficult to pass literature on. You had to painstakingly copy every single word into a new source. And so,
or hand it down orally,
when that's what it was done for hundreds and hundreds of years until it was finally written down. But then once it was written down, then it sort of had to be passed on by physically writing it out. And so something only two things were deemed to be great enough to transcribe them and carry them on for so long. And that's the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, but it's the setting again is that really like culturally defining 10-year battle with the Trojans, and the Greeks to a large degree looked up to the Trojans. The Trojans were almost a superior culture to the Greeks, and yeah, they even share a lot of common. I mean, there's so much more we could say, but that's sort of the setting of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So where it starts.
Mitchell, do you believe that the Trojan War actually happened?
Ambivalent. Don't care. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. Regardless, it was central to how the Greeks brought narrative to their understanding of the world, to their understanding of good and evil, to their understanding of like, what does one enemy owe to another? What does a father look like? What does a mother look like? This was over the course of several hundred years, it was an oral tradition that eventually became written down. And it was very definitive of what the Greeks would be. Did it actually happen? We don't have a lot of like material evidence. We only really have written evidence.
Well, I mean, it hasn't historical scholarship sort of come to an agreement that it, in fact, did happen.
Well, we know we found Troy, right? Wasn't that Heinrich Schliemann who found Troy?
Well,
at one point, they didn't even believe that Troy had ever existed.
Right.
And then Heinrich Schliemann discovers
This is why
Troy.
I'd say it's sort of like it's the why it's important and its ascendancy in our culture doesn't rely on if it happened or not. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
That's why I'm ambivalent on did it happen or not. Like irrelevant question. It's incredibly important. It has forever shaped Western civilization. Its value for that and for us is undeniable, whether or not it happened or not.
Right. And the writing or the creation of the Iliad and the Odyssey is not intended to be a historical recounting of what actually happened.
No, yes.
But is a cultural
drama
set in this war that is intended to tell us about what it means to be human.
Exactly.
And what it means to
before
be
there was a
Greek.
law code, there was the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, so even the great orators in Athens, instead of whenever they would make a case about why someone should be put in jail or exiled, they would rarely appeal to law. They didn't have a lot of law. They would often appeal to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so, I mean, that's just a clear example where this document, this oral tradition that was sort of codified and you know in the whatever century you want to put it in, 8th century BC, became such a sort of cultural bedrock that even legal arguments are now being made based upon how this character was portrayed or whatever. You know, Demosthenes would always say, and we know that this character did this and we all shamed him for it. And so this person's doing it today and we should shame them now, So we don't really have something like that, except the only thing that's comparable would be the Bible to culture today in the West. I would say the only book that's had more influence than the Iliad and the Odyssey would be the Bible.
But if you were to ask, is the Iliad about the Trojan War? Well, the Trojan War is the setting, right? But this is a character-driven work, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, right. It's really about.
Ooh, is it about Achilles or is it about Hector?
Yeah, I think it's actually about the duality of Hector and Achilles, because the whole book introduces. I'm so not talking about whatever question you had. So just I'm so far deteriorated.
It's good though. Paul, do you mind briefly a couple sentences for each work? Can you give a brief summary?
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Isn't that what you asked Mitchell to do? No, you actually didn't. Or maybe you did.
I gave the setting. The Trojan War is the setting.
So tell us.
So the Iliad is starts with Achilles being very mad. Moody, yes, because things have been taken away from him that he thought were his, and so then slaves included. Okay, we're just gonna move on from that.
An insult to his honor.
An insult to his honor. That's right. And he refuses to keep fighting for the Greeks, and then. So that whole drama continues to go on where the Greeks keep getting beaten back by the Trojans because Achilles isn't there to help. And then I guess that's when his friend Patroclus takes his armor and goes and fights on the battle looking like Achilles and ends up getting killed. Mm-hmm. And so Achilles is really mad about that. And then at some point, they negotiate a battle between Achilles and Hector. Mm-hmm. He ends up killing Hector, and Hector's father. I don't know if in English we say prime or pream, but we'll go with one of them. Comes and begs Achilles back for the body of Hector, and that's pretty much where it ends.
Yeah,
isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
And then the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus, who is one of the Greek kings. Leaving after they have successfully conquered Troy and trying to come home in the 10-year journey that it takes him to get from Troy back to Ithaca. Mm-hmm. And the struggles his wife is having and trying to stop the suitors from coming and trying to marry her and get the kingdom, and her remaining faithful to her husband, and the son trying to, hoping and seeking for his father. and sort of all the trials that brings, and Odysseus eventually coming home and having to clean house when he finally gets home.
The only thing I would add to that is that the Odyssey actually assumes that the audience knows a lot of things about that really mythic war that he didn't specify in the Iliad. So, like, one of those things being that the Greeks, when they finally did sack Troy, committed great atrocities, far greater than would have been morally allowable to do to your enemies. Goes into Priam's like family temple and murders him there in front of his gods. Takes the son of Hector and murders the son of Hector as well. And then, violates, the women and the children of the city. And that the whole point of the Odyssey is that because of the great wickedness of these people, of these Greeks, most of them don't make it back. So most of the Greeks die on the way back.
I forget the one that came home and his wife kills him.
Agamemnon comes home only to be murdered by his wife and her boyfriend because he was gone for 10 years. Which, he probably deserved it. But,
Well, but effectively, that's what you just said, right? Because of the atrocities that they perpetrated on the Trojans, this was justice.
Right.
For them to not,
the gods were so upset with
victorious.
them for their lack of honor that they experienced the punishment of the gods on their way home, and Odysseus barely makes it home, and that's the whole point.
And it takes him 10 years to do it.
And it takes him 10 years to do it.
Right. I always look at this as there's three characters here. I think Achilles, Hector in the Iliad, although Achilles is primary, and then Odysseus in the Odyssey. And so it's to me, it's Achilles' pathos, Achilles' wrath, Hector's ethos, and Odysseus' logos, right? Because Odysseus is a contrast to Achilles in terms of he's about intelligence.
He's clever, Odysseus.
He's clever.
He's always described as being clever.
Right.
Cunning,
And so that's the way I just simplistically.
That's very interesting because Achilles is all about his emotions.
Yeah.
And
the only thing I would push back on is that yes, Achilles is all about his emotions, but at no point is Achilles or Odysseus viewed as a fully actualized person, like Hector is.
Well, like Hector is, right.
Because Hector, and so in your breakdown, you could sort of tend to say that we should have a little bit of Achilles and a little bit of Hector, and a little bit of Odysseus.
And I'm not saying that's
but effectively Hector is our model, is what you're saying.
Yeah, Hector's the model. I mean in the Iliad, Achilles is inhuman compared to Hector.
Mm-hmm.
Hector is fully integrated into a society. He's a father. He's a mother. He has
character,
a prince. Yeah.
Ethos.
Did you say he's a mother? You said he's a father, he's a mother.
I didn't mean mother.
Okay,
Scratch
he's a father, he's a husband.
Yeah,
maybe
father,
you're going
he's
for.
a husband.
Okay.
He's a brother. He's a prince. So he's fully integrated. He plays a lot of roles, and he plays them all with honor, right, and with integrity. Whereas Achilles, he's moody. He withdraws from people. He withdraws from his own men. He doesn't have a father really. He has a son, but his son's not present at all, whereas Hector is very present to his son. It's one of the most moving scenes of the book when he holds up his son
before he goes to battle. Yeah.
And, also Hector's mother is very present to him, and Achilles' mother is Thetis is a goddess who's not present at all. She can't even really relate to what he's going through because she doesn't experience time. Even when she's mourning over him, she's not able. Yeah. So the relationships that he has are not human. And I think he's even portrayed as someone who is above human concerns. Hector is concerned about running into battle with, right. He turns around and almost starts to run away for a minute. Whereas, Achilles is just sort of running into it, almost with no fear, but that's not a positive, right? There's definitely, it came with a great cost.
Well, and it's interesting that you all, in talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey this way, I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, but in some ways, if Achilles and Odysseus are not the models and yet it is their side that wins the war. There's also some struggle happening within the works of like, why is it that sometimes it's the good people that end up suffering, right? The Trojans were the ones who only got in this war because one of the princes stole Helen. And I mean, stole may be a wrong word. I mean, she kind of seemed willing.
That's not included. How that happened,
right?
Isn't included in the Iliad, but it's included elsewhere.
But the Trojans only got in the war because they were willing. They weren't willing to drop a family member, right? And it's again sort of that nobility of like, right? Like this is we are people of integrity. And so even, if we have to fight for our brother, we're going to fight for our brother, even though we may not like him. And yet they're the ones that end up losing everything. Whereas the Greeks, not being fully, in Mitchell's words, not fully human, still are the ones that come out on top, but then have to suffer for that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing too is if you, it seems to me that the two works, which I understand are diptychs, right? They're actually two parts of one work, the Iliad and the Odyssey. That they sort of exemplify through Achilles and through Odysseus. They exemplify the two great values of the Greeks, which were strength and intelligence. Intelligence being the strength of the mind, right? So Achilles is that warrior, martial valor, that they admired, the Greeks admired, and Odysseus, Odysseus of many wiles, he's referred to in some of the older works. He's the one who outsmarts his enemies. He doesn't defeat them by main strength. It's his intelligence, and that when Sophocles writes the play Ajax, there's a decision that they're trying to make in that play, which is now that Achilles is dead, what do we do with his armor? And they put it to a vote, and the two nominees are Ajax, the next strongest of the warriors after Achilles, and Odysseus, who's the smarter one. And in the play, they choose Odysseus. So to me, that sort of symbolic of the cultural decision that is sort of made by the Greeks, going from military strength to philosophical intelligence. And so you then have the heroes of the mind later on, which are, Plato and Aristotle.
But let's also be clear that Odysseus is no weakling. Like when he comes home and he's the only one that can shoot the arrow through and then he like single-handedly like kills all the suitors kind of thing. I mean, he's not a weakling.
Right, but it was because how is he going to defeat all of he's completely outnumbered. Yeah. So you can't just use strength. You got to use intelligence.
Right. Yeah, he was using both, but he also let's not think of him as a nerd.
Yeah, no, not by any means.
He's a great warrior. It's kind of like Socrates. Like Socrates was the greatest warrior, the greatest taxpayer. I mean, all the things he was like the greatest at.
Socrates.
Yeah. He was the best at like eating and drinking. He was the best at fighting. He was the best.
He was with the 10,000 that was trapped in the.
I mean, he was. He fought.
He was a soldier.
Wars
in Persia.
But where are we getting the best from? How do we know that he was the best?
Just how he was characterized by Plato, and Xenophon. And the great pain of Xenophon is that he wrote at the same time as Plato. That's why no one cares about Xenophon.
Yeah, right. Damn asses.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, Mitchell, we know that when I die, you're going to be writing great things about me, regardless of whether those things are true or not. So,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's how it goes.
Don't worry, we'll make up stuff
to make up for the great deficit of character.
Well, speaking of good characters, Mitchell, can you help bridge us to today? You've put us in context. We've discussed how it would have had an impact culturally in ancient Greece, and help us build a bridge. Why does it matter that we care about these things and immerse ourselves in these works today?
Yeah. Well, and there's so much more could be say about
Mm.
how we bridge the foundation that has played for like our modern culture today. But I think just the impact that these characters have on deeply human themes, right? So, and helping us understand that. So, I mean, each one of us can probably recount the scene of Hector when he comes and he's talking to his family and they're all pleading with him not to go. And each person in the family that he goes to and sort of responds to turns into a really emotional moment, I think, for the reader. You know, like he holds up his son and right before he goes into battle, right before he talks to his wife, and he essentially says, like, may the Trojans say that you were as good as your father, but then far surpassed him in value. And what father doesn't want that for their son, that they would model, that their son would model their life after their father, but then not stop there, but be better than him. And then what mother couldn't read the scene where Hecate goes to her son and says, and she essentially bears her body to Hector and says, look at I bear the marks in my body of raising my boys. Don't have pity on me. Don't go to battle. Don't take I've put all of my investment in my future in my sons. Don't take that away from me by dying in battle. What mother doesn't bear the cost of child rearing on their body and doesn't have that same, this is my future? That is a deeply human feeling and way of articulating that feeling that, and just it gives, just like any great piece of literature, but this in a very foundational way gives us a way of talking about our own human experience and our own the things that we love and hate and should love and should hate, right? And that way it's a deeply moving. It's not cynical like a lot of modern literature. This is why Paul hates modern literature. It's deeply cynical. There's no pretension in it whatsoever. More could be said, but
well, I do want to say, just sort of as far as people that listen to this may want to pick it up. I mean, this is why we recommend reading the Trojan War for students before the Iliad and the Odyssey, is because of how entrenched this was in the Greek mind, that there are things left out of the text because there's an assumption that the reader already knows those things. So the Trojan War is one resource as a book that you can read to kind of get the full picture, and then go read the Iliad, which is, again, just that, the last section of the last year. And then, but there's also other works out there that'll have footnotes and whatnot, translations that'll help you through that. But unfortunately, it's no longer as much of a part of our consciousness as it used to be.
Well, also, people are going to ask, what translation do I use? So I'd be curious of Mitchell's.
Well, I'd be curious to know, before we got into translation, if there are other parts of the book that sort of has stood out to you, because there's so many little vignettes right along the way, like in the story. There's like an overarching story. I didn't know, were there other vignettes or sort of characters that?
For me, and I mean, it's part of the way I was taught these books with the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey, is look at the first paragraph, right? That's what the whole book's about. Sing, O Muse, the wrath of Achilles, right? That's how the Iliad starts. And so, when I read the Iliad, I'm mostly focused on that aspect and what his anger, the results the anger has on his own people. That his best friend dies because of his anger.
And then he goes and sulks.
Right. And that sulking, for whatever reason, that stood out to me and has always stood out to me.
Little boys hate that when you're reading that with them.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Yeah, but what little boy hasn't gone off and pouted?
Well,
right?
That's the irony.
And so, but you realize that, if you lose your best friend, and he's realizing in that moment that it's on him, it's because he refused to fight that his buddy went and did that. And it's just sort of like the things the culpability we take on by omission, because we don't do things, all of a sudden we have this guilt, and that's a very human experience as well.
And I think it seems like we have talked about the two great scenes. One is the sulking. He's all just looking at himself. He's not considering other people. He's just mad. He's angry. He's emotional, as he always is. And the other is that scene with Hector and his wife when he's saying goodbye to them, knowing he was holding his child, knowing that he will probably be thrown off the battlements to his death, and then his wife will, the soldiers will have their way with his wife.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't imagine a more painful action to take.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, because some lady she was a teacher. She must have tried to teach these books before. This was at a conference I was at. She was in the audience. She asked after. She says, "Well, what's so compelling about anything in those books?" I said,
Really?
and then I talked about those two scenes,
Mm-hmm.
right, and especially the one with the scene where Hector's father goes to get the body of his son,
Oh, yeah.
and the turning of Achilles' heart. I said, if you don't
Right.
have any emotion in reading those, then I don't know what to say to you.
Yeah.
And Paul, remind us, what grade and subject do we teach
Oh,
these?
we teach this in both the Iliad and the Odyssey in 8th grade. So in
Mhm.
7th grade, they will have read the Trojan War. And then in 8th grade, they start with sort of ancient Greek history, and then they read the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Mhm. And we have excellent companion guides for
We
teacher
do.
and
We
student.
do. And there's in the
Yeah.
teacher manual, there's notes to help you understand what's
Mhm.
going on and
Mhm.
that sort of thing. We are using, to go back to Martin's question, we're using the Samuel Butler translation because it's prose. But they're constantly coming out with new translations. I mean, if anybody were like, say, this is dead, I mean, it's just every couple of years, it feels like there's a new one coming out, and they're phenomenal.
Yeah.
They do. I mean, there's always good ones. And so you have to make a decision of, do you want prose or poetry? Poetry is going to be more in the spirit of the original, because the original is a poem, but it can be harder to understand.
Yeah, and the other great classic English prose translation was Andrew Lang, who did the fairy tales, and that's the one that I read last time I read it. And in the introduction to that book, he gives an apologetic for a prose translation, and it's very good. And basically, what he's saying, if he doesn't say this way, but I kind of took it this way, is this is the King James version of the Iliad
Yeah,
and the
bold
Odyssey.
statement.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that you got to remember that poetry language is different,
Mm-hmm.
and you cannot replicate
It's
in
untranslatable.
English
Yeah.
Mhm.
the verse of something in Greek
Mhm.
or Latin. It's impossible to do. So the value of the poetic aspect of the work is going to have to come from the author, who is far inferior to
From the
Homer.
translator.
Yeah.
From the translator.
From-
Yeah.
Yeah. So there may a lot of people like Lattimore, for example.
Foggles has a great
Who?
a poet, Fagels.
Fagels. Yeah, I say pronounce it Fagels, but yeah, I've heard that's good too.
Yeah, it's great.
And
and
but,
he's done
but,
all three. He's done Iliad and the Odyssey and the
Right.
Iliad.
but you have to put so much in there of yourself in
Mhm.
translating this into English verse.
Mm.
In other words, it has to be, and this is true with all translations, the translation itself has to be a great work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
And this is why we advocate learning the original languages.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know,
That's right.
I mean, in our
The
current,
best thing is to read
The
them
best
in their original.
translation is the original.
and
Is the original.
I've never reached. I mean, my Greek was pretty good. Mitchell recently looked at my translation of the Gospel of John,
Mhm.
It's pretty
and
good. Yeah, it's pretty
he
good.
thought it was pretty good.
Two thumbs
um,
up. Two thumbs.
Isn't that like the simplest book in the New
And come
Testament?
on, Martin.
Okay.
Well,
And
but
arche
rich,
ein
but
ha
really
logos
rich.
It was
kai.
And actually, I feel like
But I
Paul's
never-
translation sort of brought out even new things that I had never seen or read before.
and look at that. Look at that.
Yeah.
There's the Paul's
Yeah.
translation, the
Ooh.
message. No,
Yeah. So
taking
this is the
liberal-
gospel
taking-
of Paul.
Right.
So he had actually rewritten sections. That he did not.
The PSV, Paul Schaefer
So-
version.
But we joke about that, but the translator has a lot of power.
Well, right. And so,
Yeah.
but even with like getting to that level, I was never able to pick up Homer
It's
and
tough.
read it. But I mean, I did get that experience in the Aeneid with Latin,
Mhm.
and it really is. I mean, it's a very different experience from just
Yes,
reading
it
the
is.
English.
It is.
Mm, that's helpful.
Here's one last. Oh, I don't know if this is the last. Don't let me stop us. But why do you think the Greeks lifted up this culture, the Trojans, so high, only to destroy them?
Well, I don't think they destroyed them. They lived on in their own work. I mean, I mean, anyone reading the book, I think. I mean, who do you end up rooting for when you read this book? You root for the Trojans. Like you said, I think they were probably a superior culture in some way. And I think that's a tribute to the Greeks, that they would honor another culture in their own great work.
Well, Mitchell, maybe you would answer this question better, but is it possible the Greeks viewed this as more of a civil war than as different cultures?
Well, that's an interesting sort of route to go down.
What language did they speak?
Well, the assumption is that they understood Greek, but they probably had their own language. But they shared the same gods. Mm-hmm. They shared the same sort of moral framework. Mm-hmm. They had a lot in common, but also, Homer portrays the king Priam as a typical pagan king, right? So he has multiple wives, right? And that the Greeks would not.
There's some of the East in there.
There's some. Yeah. There's a little bit of exotic flavor to the Trojans, but they shared much. And I think actually the Trojans won the war in the end of the day, because much of what was worthy of carrying on, the idea of family, the whole idea that Hector was a man and Achilles was not. In Greek, all the Greek philosophers after Homer, who was a Greek philosopher as well as a literary author, their ideal man looks way more like Hector. Aquinas, the sort of the political animal, some person who lives in perfect integrated into his community. That's a necessary prerequisite for being good. The only person who did that well and perfectly was Hector, right? Who ultimately dies because duty. He says many times, I don't want to go down and fight this battle, but duty, because I am a good father. Well, he didn't say I'm good, but because I am a father and I am a brother and I am a prince, I have to go and sacrifice myself for that.
Well, and if you look at the Romans' great work of Virgil's Aeneid, he's articulating Rome as the new Troy. Right now, historically, that may not be true, but I think culturally, maybe it was. They're about order and the Greeks are about strength and intelligence. The Romans are about order and piety.
Here's my only caveat against this, and this is why I think the Greeks are better, because the Greeks, their greatness comes from overthrowing Troy, but in a lot of ways, Troy overthrew them,
right? In
terms of values and what it means to be human.
And that's what happened when Rome defeated the Greeks. The same thing happened. They were militarily conquered the Greeks,
before
the Greeks culturally conquered the Romans.
That is true, but how did Rome actually become great before the Greeks? They abused the Etruscans. And they didn't write anything good about them. They just sort of ignored that they existed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm reading Theodore Mommsen right now on this, and I don't, you're simplifying.
I am. To make Greek better.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But that cultural contrast between the Greeks and the Romans is very similar to the cultural contrast between the Greeks and the Trojans.
Especially because, going full circle back here to Cicero and Plutarch. Plutarch was a Greek. Cicero and the highly educated Romans went to Greece, hired Greek tutors to come. And so in a lot of ways, the Greeks did conquer the Romans.
Yes.
Not actually, but.
Yes.
Good discussion today.
The Romans was just good at taking in the great things of other cultures. And they saw Greece for what it was, and they took advantage.
They didn't like democracy because... mob rule and all. But, and really after that, no one liked democracy until really never. I mean, I don't think there's been a real...
the Enlightenment.
I guess some of the Italian city-states tried to do democracy, but I think Machiavelli makes a pretty good argument that that's a bad choice.
No, that wasn't the new, one of the books we're reading right now, Virtue Politics by James Hankins, makes the whole case that if you go back to Plutarch and that time in the Renaissance, that the form of government did not matter to them as much as it did the virtue of the leaders.
100%.
That's a good note to end on.
That same in democracy as it is in aristocracy. If you got a lot of bad people running the government, it's no better than one bad person running the government.
Aristotle does say, if you could choose between one form of government, let it be the case that you have a highly virtuous king.
Who said this?
Aristotle.
Sure, Aristotle did. but not the Renaissance people who were contemporaries of Machiavelli.
A lot of bad came out of
Machiavelli
Renaissance.
was the minority.
Part
view.
2 of this podcast is pro-Renaissance, con Renaissance.
Okay, Jess.
On that episode, we're going to have Tanya be
And
the referee
another
with a
thing.
whistle.
With the whistle.
With a whistle.
Third time's the charm. Maybe we can close
Gonna
this
try
out.
it. Gonna try it. But it has been a good discussion.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thanks for joining us,
It's
Mitchell.
great to be here. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, and thank you for listening. You can find any of our resources on the Iliad and the Odyssey at memoriapress.com. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.